In this episode, I interview Mark Paul, the founder of Itheum. Itheum is focused on empowering personal data sovereignty with a focus on making core personal data protocol for the Metaverse era. Mark has a background in healthcare, and we talked about the challenges of the healthcare system, both in Australia, the United States, and other countries. We talked about potential ways that Itheum and more broadly blockchain organizations, protocols, can disrupt the way that healthcare is not only operated, but funded and incentivized. The idea of DAOs being used as effectively competitive models to insurance. And we considered what it might look like for people to pull their data from healthcare providers, keep it in a smart contract, either on-premise or in the cloud, and then transmit it to the data providers that they're working with. So all sorts of really engaging ideas. It was a really brainstorming kind of conversation with Mark, which I very much enjoyed, and I hope you found valuable. So here is Mark Paul. All right, Mark. Well, just like that, bam, we are live and recording. Love what you're working on, Itheum. I was reading the white paper earlier and diving deeper into what you guys have done. Just rewinding the clock a little bit, you've been working on this since about 2016, is my understanding. Previous, you were working on a business in Sydney, Australia for healthcare, Health Direct. I'd love to learn your transition, like what you were working on there and kind of setting the foundation for how you started Itheum.
Yeah, so my background is not really in crypto. I come from 20 years of traditional tech background. I started my career working with MSN here in Australia, Microsoft Network, in the old school days, right? Like working on MSN Messenger, Hotmail, and all these local implementations of this sort of technology. I think around 8 years ago, I was introduced to like the whole digital health space and health tech in specific area. This was something that was quite interesting to me because I loved like large data. I love big problems to solve, and there's no bigger problem to solve than in healthcare, right? Because this is one of the most broken systems you could say. So I started off working for a genomics startup, and we were trying to do personalized genomics testing. This is where I got exposed to the whole sort of large data sets. And then had the idea, right? So not the idea, but I had a concern. It began with a concern where I looked at data in general, and I realized that most of the high value data was locked up in these silos owned by enterprises, government, and all these sort of institutions. And this was when I started working for the government as well, specifically the area of digital tech. And that's kind of another area where I looked at and said, wow, this problem is pretty prevalent everywhere you go. I started Itheum as a Web 2 platform, and effectively what it had the ability to generate high value data, and think of it as a scheduled, structured data collection through multiple channels, your apps, social media, your fitness devices. So we built data adapters that you could subscribe to, and they collect data and attach it to you. And it was a traditional tech stack. We were not really thinking about crypto then. But the idea was, even in Web 2, if you generate any high value data, it should belong to you. So this was the initial seed of an idea of Itheum. We started off thinking that this is probably going to be very useful in digital health. I then, working for the government, working for a few years, I really felt like I need to get out of that Web 2 world, really focus on Itheum. So about a year ago, we built a proof of concept on how the data collected through the existing Web 2 platform, we could tokenize it and trade it in a decentralized way using a data DEX, which is one of the products that we have. And this got a lot of attention. We raised some funding. We got incubated and launched by the Elrond blockchain, one of the largest blockchains in Europe. And yeah, that's kind of how the story story goes. And I think we found a home in Web3 because this is where ownership could be proved, and it just was a natural fit for us.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit more about the problem you identified in healthcare. So specifically Australia, you view one of the problems as the consolidation of data in healthcare with the government. Is that the problem? And if it is, why is that? What are the externalities of that problem?
Yeah. It's not a unique problem to Australia. If you look at, and I'll talk about specifically government here, but I think this could be applied to any country. Most of the data that's collected on citizens via the government, they originate through initiatives from different departments, right? Like disconnected departments. And by default, what they do is they collect it into a silo that they control. And one of the biggest issues is how do you connect these silos within government, right? Because firstly, the reason they're putting it in this silo and like protecting it is because it is really sensitive data, right? Like citizen data is very sensitive. But this causes the other problem where the data sets are now completely disconnected. So you really can't, as a citizen of Australia, my healthcare data set is disconnected from my social data set, is disconnected from my identity data sets. And this causes like a really high friction environment, right? Like you can't really build any really high value sort of software on top of this that can really, bring out the power of this data. And we have to understand why they do this. And the reason they do this is to protect the data, because they can't have this data leaked out. They can't open this out. They can't make this an open data set like many other industries could do. But of course, it leads to a lot of issues as well.
I love this idea. So where do I even want to start? So do you see the inevitable product roadmap of maybe putting aside Itheum, but thinking about this as data and healthcare more broadly? In the US, I imagine it's similar in Australia. The way that the market is structured, or let me just speak for the US for a second, it's a combination of private and public funding that goes into both employer-based and then public under Medicaid, which is if you're poor, and then Medicare if you're very old. But there's a large private market. That private market is full of innovation. There's a lot of companies building like direct care models where you pay to access a physician and you pay for labs, for instance. Of course, where the government is not a part of the system innovates and thrives. Not to say there's no space for government in healthcare, because I think there is, but the question of data accessibility to me presents a couple of these externalities. Like you mentioned, one is the ability to aggregate the data and do things with it, namely research or ways of improving the system. The other I see is just the portability from one provider to the other. If I move across the country, how do I take that data and then port it into the new provider that I'm working with? It works if those two providers, doctors, offices, or hospitals happen to be using the same software, but sometimes they're not. And then there's also the question of why don't I benefit from having access to that data? So like hospitals will aggregate the data and then they'll sell off that data to like pharmaceutical companies or other companies that want to aggregate the anonymous metadata effectively and do stuff with it. It seems to me like the product roadmap of this, and I know you've thought a lot about this, would be, okay, we're not gonna try to completely flip the existing game. Like I think that's just so deeply entrenched in the government and the private companies, and there's so much money and history there. But I think the pathway is you allow people to export their data, which is now really on the forefront of regulation, allowing people to export the data and then have it be in like a smart contract format to then port over into other providers. Is that how you're thinking of this, or what's the evolution of the roadmap in your mind to a world where we are decentralized and secure in the store and transaction of health data?
Yeah. So healthcare is a very complex area, right? So we begun trying to solve the problem you just mentioned in healthcare. And we very quickly realized that if we stick to healthcare, we're going to keep hitting the roadblocks and we're just not going to get tech out. So we then branched off and said, listen, we're a horizontal platform. We don't align to any vertical. We're building a general purpose platform. But healthcare is very important to us because that's where we want to solve the big value, high value problems. Now, going back to your question, the challenge is, yes, you're right. You can't. We're talking to some of these big sort of enterprise players who are in health, and it's very obvious that you can't flip this system in its current form. It's too tightly coupled. It's like a monolith, right? It's a beast. There's no way you can go and tell them, hey, here's this really cool tech, adopt it. So our approach to this is to kind of go after the low-hanging fruits. And for us, one of the lowest-hanging fruits is wellness data. All of your smart device data that you're generating, this data set is completely ignored in the healthcare system, right? All they're looking at is clinical data. So our approach is, okay, let's unlock the wellness data and let people own it and let people tokenize it and let people trade this. And then by doing this, we at least get people into the system. Now they're kind of sharing their wellness data. We're aggregating that into a pool. We're creating this high value data set from the bottom up. And we're tokenizing it, and maybe we enable decentralized trade of these data sets. I think once we do this, what we're going to see is people starting to get open to the idea of maybe bringing in a little bit more structured clinical data in. Maybe if you go and get your x-rays done or your blood tests done, you download these sort of results and you upload it as documents, and then you add it to your wellness data, and then now you grow your data set as such. What's interesting, though, is when we talk to some of these health research institutes and some of these sort of incumbent players who are used to a way of working, they're very interested in the idea of decentralized governance. So, and when we talk to them, we specifically talk about that. So Itheum has a concept of a data coalition DAO. The idea is actually quite simple. It states that no one's going to trade data peer-to-peer. It's such a difficult thing to do and a complex thing to understand. So even when we're going to do decentralized data trading, it's going to go through some decentralized governance. And the Data Coalition DAO provides the decentralized governance, but with fair value trade that's happening. They're quite interested in this concept because what they do want, the traditional players, is that they want to bring the actual participants into the governance model. And this is probably due to, a risk, maybe just purely a risk mitigation point of view. They want to be able to say that the actual participants in this trial, as an example, had a seat in the transparent governance that we have. So we find that they're quite interested in the governance, not specifically letting go of the data. Whereas the private health companies, they are also interested in the governance. But I think what we are really trying to do is go for the bottom-up approach. It's going to be very hard to knock this at the top and try to get the top to adopt it. We're going for the bottom-up approach, get the humans like you and me who are generating these petabytes worth of data. Let us, partake in the system, create the pool of data at the bottom, which cannot be ignored.
Interesting. And what's both the application API or the surface area? How are you accessing the data? And then what are the types of data points that people would enter into, or that you'd get? What is wellness data? Like footsteps? I'm thinking like a what are the hip? I don't wear any of these things, but the trackers for your blood pressure and how many steps you took in a day. Are those the kind of things you're talking about?
Yeah, so Itheum has a concept of data adapters. So we build adapters that think of it as syncing with your smart devices. The first app we built was called the Red Heart Challenge. So this was think of it as a pilot project we built on top of Itheum. So Itheum is a platform that you can build these sort of real world bridging apps, data bridging apps into it. So the Red Heart Challenge was the first app we built. This was collecting blood pressure data. We had integrated with a blood pressure device, which via a Bluetooth sensor, we actually pulled in the data. So we built an adapter for that. What we also did was not just collect, the Red Heart Challenge was a cardiovascular health app. So it was just not blood pressure, but blood pressure collected in different ways. As an example, collect a reading in the morning versus a reading in the evening, collect a reading from both arms, because all of these sort of variants tells you things. And then we also collected things about their lifestyle, right? Their diet, their fitness, their activity, their mood. And we aggregated all these data sets into a single program that we call the Red Hat Challenge. But theoretically, if your smart device exposes an API, we could write an adapter that brings it in, and you come into a platform, you log in with your address, and you claim ownership of that data set.
What is the Red Hat Challenge? Is it done? What is it?
It is an app built on Itheum. If you go into our data decks, in fact, I think on our website at the bottom, there's a link to it as well, but you can literally sign up to it. The entire app is coordinated over the Telegram chat app. So this is how our bot collects some sort of periodic data from you. It's a 3-week program. And when you come out of the 3-week program and you follow it, you can effectively get some insights about your cardiovascular health that you might not have known before. And the idea is you claim ownership of the data set. You take that within our data decks, you align to a data coalition DAO that's interested in bulk aggregating this data set. And we create a cardiovascular bulk pool of data.
And is that manually entered by people? They're just saying, what's your blood pressure? Or is it connected via some?
It's both. So the one that's actually on our site is a manual form. Like you have to, it explains to you what you need to do. And then at a certain time, it reaches out to you on Telegram. It says, okay, time to take your blood pressure. You take your blood pressure, you enter it in a form. It's got the smarts to detect if you incorrectly entered it, or if it can even detect a very irregular pattern. So let's say you were just click spamming there, and it'll compare your previous reading and say, this looks a bit fake. But we also have an adapter that we built with a clinical blood pressure device called A&D. And we had a Bluetooth adapter that we had built. But of course, that's very proprietary to people who own that specific device. We found out that people prefer to enter their blood pressure because they're very people who are monitoring their heart health. They're very used to that pattern of using a smartphone app and manually entering their blood pressure data in there.
Yeah, got it. So people go through this program for a few weeks. They enter in the data of their wellness. That gets put on chain, and then from there, is it their ability to send it? Like where does it go? What's the next step from there? So you have a bunch of people's data on chain.
Yeah. So Itheum as a platform think of it as 3 groups of products. So the one we're talking about now is the first group. It's called the Data CAT. CAT stands for Collection and Analytics Technology. So this is where the real world entities build the structured data collection, right? So it's very important that it's structured data and it's high value data. It's very unlikely that all data is going to go on chain because there's just too much of data. So we need to generate high value data sets. So that's what our first product does. So Red Hat Challenge is an app that runs on it. OK Pulse is probably another good example. It's a corporate wellness app that's running on it. And Just Not Health, we're working on a Gamer Passport, which is basically unlocking gaming data. All of these apps sit on the Data Cat. Now, this is where we're generating the high-value data sets. Next is we need to get the individuals, you and me, to claim ownership of it on Web3. So that's our second product. It's called the Data Dex, Decentralized Exchange for Data. So when you log in to the Data Dex, it can detect all the apps that you have joined through the Data Cat, and you can literally go and claim ownership of your data sets. And what you're doing when you say claim ownership is you are one of 2 things. You are minting it as a data NFT, which makes it sort of an NFT sort of format representation of your data, or you're minting it as a data pack. A data pack is it's like think of it as like a semi-fungible token where you can trade an unlimited copies of this data. But if you're concerned about the amount of copies of your data, you mint it as a data NFT. So the second part is where you actually bring and claim ownership of your data into Web3. So then we have to work out, like, what do you do with this data now, right? Like, you could literally peer-to-peer trade it, but as I was saying, realistically, this is not going to happen. You have to bulk trade it. And now we come to the third part of our product, which is called the Data Metaverse. And within the Data Metaverse, there's some cool things that happen. Firstly, you prove your identity in a soul-bound way. So you mint a soul-bound avatar and you link all your data sets implicitly to it. And then you align to a data coalition DAO, which is a virtual governance model where you, via the DAO, bulk trade happens. So these three components sit together to form what we believe is the data platform for the metaverse.
Interesting. Okay, so data collection, data validation, identity validation, and then do stuff with it, basically.
So data collection, the claiming ownership of the data, and then do stuff with it, with your identity. One thing to note, though, Mike, is we don't store data on chain. You cannot store data on chain. The blockchain is really not built for that. Our data sets, you could store it. The choice is the actual users. They can choose to store it decentralized, or we have been asked quite often now that they'd rather keep their data sets on premise, and we bring our tech into it and we provide the proofs somehow to the on-premise sort of adapters, which is something we're looking at right now.
Interesting. And the people that you're referring to would be like individual people, or they be healthcare providers or companies?
Yeah, so if it's a healthcare vertical, then we're talking to healthcare providers. So as an example, Sanopass is a project we're working on. They're one of the largest preventative health providers in Europe. And they are building Metaverse health passports, and we're talking to them. So they're an example of someone who wants their data on premise, but they want to leverage the pipeline of bridging it into Web3 and then trading it in the Metaverse. So we are kind of working on this sort of with them. But our software requires a software stack is not specific to healthcare, right? So, in gaming, as an example, we're talking to gaming guilds and we're generating gamer passports for members of a gaming guild. So similar concept as healthcare, but in a different vertical. And likewise, all it requires is some entity that wants to incentivize a pool of people to share data. And then somehow this entity wants to provide some governance whilst incentivizing the people to trade, sort of a percentage of the trade.
I would think intuitively that you would have that the world of healthcare is massive. It's the largest part of our economy. It's 18% of GDP in the United States. It massively, I don't like the word broken. The financial incentives are massively misaligned from the people paying to the people receiving the end value from the healthcare itself. And I feel like there's a couple of things that come to mind. I'm curious your reaction to these. One is the research arm of the academics. So like if you're running a clinical trial on something, whether it's a pharmaceutical drug or an intervention or some kind of, it could be even a dietary change, that there is a lot of money and a lot of red tape required for any kind of trial to happen. And I feel like there's a pathway for not only like mobile apps and very inexpensive Bluetooth connected healthcare devices, but also the linking of those on chain to allow a lot of really low cost, super efficient, fast trials to be done where they couldn't have been before. It's like you need, I don't know how many millions, but it's in the millions to even run a trial. The other thing I think about is this, interoperability between organizations, even small organizations of like one or two practitioners in a place. It seems like the backbone of the healthcare. When we say healthcare is broken, we mean that it's you pay way more than what you receive. It maybe is very slow. You could identify like feature faults. And to me, it feels like the backbone is what's misaligned, like the financial incentives and the way data moves. So I say all that to just ask you, is healthcare equally as exciting as gaming? Do you see this as, because one of the challenges in traditional companies is you can be spread too thin, going after multiple verticals at a time. And I just see healthcare as so huge and vast and complicated and massive. But I'm curious to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah, so we are actually not spreading ourselves too thin. We are only focusing on two verticals when it comes to pilot projects. Healthcare and gaming, and these are literally opposite end of the spectrum, right? But the reason we're doing this is because we talk to healthcare because they've got real problems, real world problems to solve, but they are slow to move. And we talk to gaming, which have equally massive data sets and equally complex problems to solve. And, they are willing to adapt our technology next month. So we are launching a pilot project literally next month for the Gamer Passport after like a couple of discussions, right? So this is, whilst doing this sort of dual approach, we are able to build our tech, take it to market, show the healthcare people, listen, you could have the same model on your side of the world as well. Unlock these data silos, see how it goes. So that's our approach. Now, going back to your question about even solving like the smallest problems, like in the example of a few practitioners or clinic, or even health research in that's unlocking a lot more data. The issue in healthcare is that no one trusts each other, right? And this is the biggest problem. If, as an example, Mike, you collect a bunch of your smart health data, you walk up to your doctor and say, hey, here's my data, maybe in your mobile app, and say, hey, can you have a look at it? They're not going to trust it, right? How do they know, for example, that it's actually your data? How do they know that you actually collected data in the right way, in the right format? If somebody asked you to take a blood pressure reading at home, you'd be surprised that if you take it sitting down in a weird way, you're going to get a skewed reading. This is why when you go to a clinic, they make you sit in a specific way and they take your blood pressure. So patient-generated data is generally low trust data. No one trusts it, right? And that's one of the first problems we encountered earlier on. So this is in my traditional, not in Itheum, but when I was working, it's very hard to tap into patient-generated data. And secondly, even within the healthcare system, they don't trust each other, right? So the doctor probably doesn't trust that I've gone to a radiologist, taken my X-ray, I've walked into the doctor's clinic and I presented my X-ray to my doctor. The doctor's probably going to want a secure message from the radiologist to prove their identity and so on. So this whole system is a bunch of transactions with people who don't trust each other. And this is, I would say, fundamentally the reason healthcare is so broken is because we end up building softwares and technology stacks that hoard data and create silos because we don't trust each other. And I think blockchain has the biggest value to bring to this sort of ecosystem, where we can bring this trustless transaction through things like not just blockchain, but just things like DIDs and verifiable credentials. We can, and couple that with blockchain, we are able to at least create the possibility that we can trust without having a third party to say that we need someone to trust each other. So let's first solve the seamless transactions between the players. And then I think we'll attack the second problem, which is why are you holding data? Now that we have a trustless system, you probably don't have to hold your data as much anymore. Let the patient generate some data. Let us generate the proofs of this data from the patient, and now that at least you know from the time the patient collects it to the point it comes into your software via the blockchain stack and the proofs, you can actually guarantee that the data was not tampered with. So maybe now you can use the patient-generated data. So I think to even solve like a small problem in healthcare, we need to go after like the sort of the lowest hanging fruit. And I would say if you introduce them to the concept of DAO-based governance and collective decision-making and data sharing, that might be the foot in the door. Once we get in there, we can then introduce them to the other concepts that they might be more open to accepting.
Interesting. I had never heard of the big problem articulated in that way of data transfer. It makes sense to me. I witnessed that anecdotally, where one doctor won't take x-rays from another. How do you view the world as, what changes in the world if this is, say, dramatically improved? How would the experience for individuals change or improve?
I think you mentioned it earlier on this conversation, the portability of your data, which is incredible.
Okay,
that in itself is mind-blowing, right? The fact that you have complete portability of your data. I go to my doctor, I literally go to my next doctor, he knows everything about my history. I go overseas and I have an accident, I go to the hospital, they know everything about my history. This completely doesn't exist at the moment, right? Like literally every time. I mean, forget about doctors. Think about a dentist, right? You go to a dental clinic. They take an X-ray of your mouth or they scan your mouth, and you go to the next dental clinic and they do the whole thing again, and they literally don't share data. Like literally, like you have, even if you go and ask them, can I have my data? You have to sign some form.
Yeah.
And you got to literally get a CD of your data. Like they make it so difficult that you don't even do it. So that's, dentistry, like a private health. In government, it's significantly worse. Like so I think just the portability alone will change the individual health citizens' experience of healthcare. But I think what would really be amazing is if we are able to unlock these data silos, the opportunity it opens up for health research, it's incredible. Like drug repurposing is one of the areas that requires a lot of data, a lot of trial participants, and it's just such a broken experience at the moment. So just that alone is huge. Can you imagine a DNA marketplace, a genomics data marketplace, and what that would open up in terms of research and development of low-cost drugs and chronic disease prevention? It's incredible, man. But I think these ideas have been spoken about for years. I personally have been talking about this for 7 years now, and with very little traction. And that's because the system is so old and the system is so pieced together that they're not willing to change it. So I think what we have to do is go after the low-hanging fruit, and that's always go after wellness data. I think that's one way to get in, and try to bring in some form of hybrid decentralized governance model that exposes them to Web3, and then we start bringing in the other pieces in.
How is Australia structured in terms of the, like in the US, for instance, there's a lot of political agitation about healthcare, namely who people will often say that healthcare should be universal. They'll use the word universal, and they'll stress the idea that everyone should have access to basic healthcare. Healthcare, objectively speaking, is a finite resource. There's only so many people, so many doctors. You can't make people work. So people could just not do it. You can prevent them from doing things. You could say you can't open a doctor's office. You can't do this. So speaking about the edge cases, or speaking about the conditional requirements, I think of healthcare as you want a healthcare system where people who are very poor get access to emergency services and basic services, but that there's a healthy and thriving market in a healthy and thriving society. There's a healthy and thriving market of electoral, voluntary, like pay for service healthcare. And I think I think the trap, if we move to universal basic health care for all, meaning that our taxes go to this large honeypot of the government, and then the government dictates how much care and where it goes, and the government makes all the decisions about distributing the resources for healthcare. The challenge, the major downside in that model is that while everyone would have universally the same access to healthcare, you're taking so much of the incentives for health providers away from the direct relationship with patients. One of the reasons why every other industry works so well in the free market is that if you don't do a good job washing my car or painting a house, then I'm just not going to hire you. I'm going to give you a bad review. And so there's this natural filtration mechanism. And I fear that, and I have seen this, my wife is a surgeon and talks about this stuff. She worked at a county hospital in Los Angeles. And there's when the incentive structure disappears and it's managed by a central bureaucratic government body, the actual participants in the network, the nurses, the administrative staff, the doctors, et cetera, they don't have a top-down incentive structure. There's no one saying, hey, we got to hit these goals, we got to perform in this way. They'll say these things, but there's no actual incentives. There's not this is, you do a better job and you get more business kind of thing. And I wonder if this is, first of all, if you agree with my framing of this, and then if you also agree that this is important to have kind of a free market, open, innovative part of the healthcare system on the services side.
Yeah, that's an awesome observation, right? And I think it's a lot more complex when it comes to actual implementation. Health is one of those areas where, yeah, okay, maybe first I'll start with talking about how Australia does it. And I think, you know, generally people are quite happy with our healthcare here. So we have Medicare here, right? So that's provided at the federal government level. So every citizen, I can walk into my doctor, I walk out, I don't pay a cent. I can walk into a public hospital, I walk out, I don't pay a cent. The people you talk to who have like chronic disease and like, you know, or like acute issues, they generally, you know, I've never met anybody and from my network who say, I don't like the system. Now, so that's, I guess, universal social healthcare, right? Now, we also have incentivized by the government, though, if we earn a certain amount per year to get private health insurance. And therefore, I now have access to private healthcare, private hospitals. And if we do not get it, we are penalized a certain percentage of tax to kind of compensate for that. So the government kind of says, if you can afford it, I want you to take the burden off the public health system, go down the path of private health. So we, like, as an example, I've got private health, and, you know, if something goes wrong, I have a choice of going to a private hospital versus public hospital. Now, surprisingly, public hospitals perform pretty well here. So, and most people end up, even with private health, they end up going to the public hospital because they see a doctor a lot quicker. It's kind of weird. And it's kind of hardwired into us as well to always go to the public health system. Strange. But now going back to the incentive model, and I do agree with you on that, the current system of how, regardless of the level of service the doctor provides, they're going to get paid. And regardless of, and also the doctor's getting paid for the quantity of service they provide as well. In other words, if they send me to go and get like a scan or an x-ray or a referral, they're getting paid for that as well. They're getting paid for the time they spend with me. So if they spend a 15-minute slot versus a 30-minute slot. So what doctors have got into, the mindset the medical system have got into, and, you know, is that it's become like, I got to churn this amount per day and I'm going to get this much of money. So it's become, as you can imagine, super reactive, right? Like they don't really want, I don't think they mean to do this, but they don't really want to solve this problem. For them, it's better that if you keep coming back over and over again at a regular frequency, they're getting paid. Now, in your world, if this system didn't exist and they had to actually provide proactive healthcare, and just like everything else, like you mentioned, like every other industry in the world is, you know, you have to provide a good service or you get a bad review and you don't go to this person again. But I think in healthcare, this is the problem, right? We don't, how do we know that, how do we know for sure that if we take away this sort of social healthcare or public healthcare, that the system would play out like every other industry? Because healthcare is very different. It's very emotional. Are we still going to have the same problems in some way? So I think, I really don't know, man. I think the solution to this is maybe some form of hybrid model, right? Like you have to provide sort of universal healthcare. I feel like you don't want people to not have that certainty that if they get unwell, they can't even see a doctor. I think if they don't have that confidence, they'll have no confidence in anything else in their life. Forget about government, but their family would be in a bad situation. Their relationships are going to be. So I think you need that, give them that assurance. But how do we then still hold the medical system and the participants accountable for proactive healthcare? Maybe, I don't know. And I know in Australia, they are trying this, like they try proactive healthcare initiatives, but it's still very low buy-in. Generally, the churn model and the reactive model is much more profitable, I would say.
Yeah, fascinating. I want to add a couple just reactions to that. One, I feel that, first of all, I think it's amazing that Sydney or Australia generally has a successful model where the government is funding healthcare, because that is kind of abnormal to how most other countries who've taken this approach work, with exceptions. It seems to me that the healthcare across the board in Western countries, at least, the healthcare industry is burdened with people who are unusual if you look at the tradition of, like, say, rewind the clock a couple thousand years. People are very unhealthy. If you took an average person 100 years ago, I heard the statistic recently, and you looked at how they spend their money per capita GDP, they're spending roughly 18% on food and 6% on healthcare. Today, that number is flipped. People spend way less of their money per capita on food, about 6%, about 18% of that is on healthcare. And so people are way less healthy. Generally, the main indicator of that is weight. In the US, for instance, and many other countries, like Mexico, I think is very close. Many other countries, like, the majority of people are obese. Like, it's, at least, I shouldn't say majority. In the worst states in the United States, which are in the southeast corner, it's roughly 28 to 32% of people who are obese. And some people are just, morbidly obese. And when your diet is so poor, and your not just your diet, but your lifestyle is so poor, you will have just a ridiculous amount of healthcare costs. And so I think to look at this and say, well, we got to have more drugs. We got to have a better healthcare system. It's so intertwined. Like, if you look at someone who walks in the front door and you say, "Oh, it's the knee," or they have a heart problem, or whatever it is, that's not the problem. That's the result of the problem. The problem is this person's, like, they're going to be right back in, a couple weeks from now. And healthcare providers know this. And the thing to, like, acknowledge is that this is true of every industry. Has this curve where they first are solving a big systemic problem, like, hey, we're all riding around on horses, we want to get somewhere faster, let's make cars. They make cars are everywhere, everyone has access to a cheap car. How do I keep selling cars? Then you're now in the end of the S curve, where companies get together, they form coalitions, they lobby governments, they do things like pass laws that have shittier roads, so then the cars break down more often, so they sell more cars. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about in healthcare, where it's like, well, how do you make it so doctors aren't incentivized to see more patients? And I think it's on the individual. Personally, I view it's the responsibility of the person paying or receiving the value that they understand what value looks like, and they are incentivized to not go back to the doctor or not have my car break down. So I think this is the point that I think a lot of people don't address, is just people don't want to be unhealthy. It's not a desirable state of being. And that is motivation alone. It should be massively motivating to live a good life and a healthy life and not be obese. But I think the delusion that we're kind of in is this is just not acknowledged as a major problem. It's like, oh, the problem is in health. Let's fix the healthcare system, realign things. You made good points, and those are valid points, but they kind of ignore the elephant in the room, which is, like, people walking in the front door. It's an absolutely massively unhealthy population, generally speaking, to deal with. That's why Japan is one of the most efficient healthcare systems out there, because they have a culture that at least eats healthy. People are very rarely obese, and so that just has positive downstream effects. So just wanted to throw that's my rant.
No, I think about this a lot as well, man. Like, firstly, Australia is doing good with the public healthcare system because our population is quite small, right? Like 22 million or something like that. In US, it's, you guys are like 300 million, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong, but it's very hard. It's a numbers game, right? Like, how do you give free healthcare? So I guess I understand the US model of healthcare. Yeah, man. Maybe, because sometimes I think that, like, if we're looking at if people are unhealthy, what we need to do is team them up with people from the healthcare system in a better way, right? So maybe the unhealthy chronic disease patient is teamed up in a proactive sort of care circle with healthcare individuals, and they're both incentivized to improve their current situation, right? Because the individuals come from different backgrounds. We don't know why they are in that state where they feel like they have to overeat. They're just compensate. Like, there's something going on there. So I think it's unreasonable to tell them, okay, you need to lose weight, because we don't really know what's causing that problem. But if we can team them up in a sort of a care model where there is a clinician, there's a dietitian, there's maybe mental health support. And all these participants are now incentivized to improve this dynamic, right? Because if they can improve the patient, then that impacts them as well. They, the healthcare system benefits, the government benefits. So maybe DAOs and, blockchain-based token incentive models in this aspect might work, like mini sort of care DAOs, right? Like it could be.
Let me pitch you on something. You just inspired an idea. So the origin of healthcare insurance in the United States started in Texas from a teachers union. A bunch of teachers got together and they said, we're going to put into a pot money that if any one of us gets hurt, we're gonna distribute that out. And that grew, and it, religious organizations like Christian groups, churches had their own pods, effectively, of people anywhere from 50 to a couple hundred people, where they all put in, and if anyone got hurt, they'd pay for it. Back then, healthcare was a lot simpler, and people would pay for it directly. Then what happened, at least in the United States, 1942, after the war, there was massive inflation going on. And Theodore Roosevelt was president at the time. And one of the ways that he thought would be a great idea to slow down inflation was to put a salary cap on high-paying executives. At the time, were like automotive companies. And so these guys couldn't make over some amount, fixed cap. So the way that they got around that was they were offering, the car companies were offering people healthcare benefits. They said, the government stopped us. We can't pay you what we think you're worth, what you are worth. So we're going to offer you healthcare. We're going to we're going to create a network of doctors, and we're going to offer you healthcare insurance in case something happens. That kind of became industry universal. And after the war, the president saw this happening and incentivized it, would give like tax discounts for companies who offered healthcare. Fast forward to today, and it's now mandatory. If you're over 50 people as an employer, you have to offer healthcare benefits. If you don't get healthcare insurance, you're penalized. My idea, what you just said, was, what if we take this as like a full circle evolution, where instead of having this massive system, at least in this country, 300 million people all under one roof, because then there's no, I don't know the other people in the network, just everybody is in this, because you want to have this sort of incentive where, like, I'm actually incentivized for you to be better. That's why like churches are successful, as a group of people who care about each other, that help each other. Like, I think statistically, if you're part of a church, you're way less likely to be homeless, depressed, mental health. That's kind of, I'm not personally religious or affiliated, but I just know that to be true. So you could have this DAO, DAO pods, where you say, okay, we suggest 50 people or more, max at 1,000. You get together and you're all participating in this, meaning you contribute to it financially, and it just automatically gets pulled out through your wallet or put it into this. And there's this pot, and you have the decentralized governance mechanisms through the DAO, which is the beautiful part. And so if there's any decisions about things that need to happen, they can happen on chain. Like, this is a crazy story, but a friend of mine was running a large company, 3,000 people, and they were offering healthcare insurance, like they have to by law. And one of his employees had a ovarian cancer. So this woman wanted to get this treatment, but the treatment was like $3 million. It was some insane amount, like $3 million treatment. And she wasn't gonna be able to work really for the rest of her time at the company. And so the decision of whether or not to pay for this got kicked up from the outsourced, like Blue Cross Blue Shield health insurance provider, all the way up to his desk, where he's a tech guy and he runs this company. And now he has to make a decision on whether or not to pay for this. And it just was like, why on earth would this be the governance model for deciding healthcare? So I see it as like DAOs to allow people to contribute to and pay for health insurance. Health insurance is like, it's a pretty awesome idea.
It is, man. I mean, there's definitely something here, like social, we can call it something like a social health, right? Like community health. Or I think that's probably a thing, I'm sure. Which just reminded me, I think the UK has a similar model. If I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I know there's somewhere, probably the UK, where they have a model where every citizen is aligned to like a local health sort of area district. And if I'm not mistaken, every citizen has a budget, a health budget that actually depletes. So the practitioner or the citizen's assigned doctor is responsible for keeping the health within that budget. And I think the less they use, or something along the lines of they improve the lives of their patient and then they don't have to use as much, they get incentivized more. So I believe there is something like this in traditional health. But what we're talking about is, taking this model to the public, right? Like literally taking it to them and saying, join one of these sort of pods, health pods. But the challenge is always going to be, would they actually contribute into the pod? Like how do we get them, like you and me, when we join one of these pods, to contribute into it, right? Like, because we're going to pool some money. That might be a challenge, because I think if wouldn't people say that, okay, I'm healthy, why would I pay for you? You're unhealthy.
Yeah. Well, I think you need the other side of the coin. You need the ability for providers to issue on-chain requests for funding for services rendered. So if I'm a doctor, say I'm a primary care physician, you come into the office, I cover this amount. The contract is on chain. So it's like, hey, you pay, 0.1 Bitcoin or whatever it is, USD, but it's paid on chain. You're making a payment to me. So that's logged. And then I'm now proving that services are rendered. You're validating that on chain, like, scan it could be simple for people. It doesn't have to be complicated. They don't even necessarily have to know that they're using blockchain infrastructure. The patient validates that they've received the care, and then money is sent to the provider's wallet.
I think this is definitely, it's inevitable that this is going to happen, right? Because going back to the problem is no one trusts each other in healthcare. And that's why we have such a fragmented model. So if we can just remove the need for such explicit trust through blockchain governance or any means, I think we'll already see some benefits coming out of it.
Do you see a pathway for Itheum? I know currently you were talking about the 3 modes of collecting data, validating that data, in signing it, and then allowing people to effectively use it. Do you see a pathway for the payment facilitation, or do you think of Itheum really as like data primary?
Well, so we have a token called the Itheum Token, and it's not really a payment token. It's a utility token to unlock access to data. So if you want access to the bulk pool of data from the data coalition, or I want to get your data NFT, I give you some Itheum, and then that's how I get access to your data. So it kind of doubles, I guess, as a payment for access kind of thing, but it's not explicitly payment. It's a utility token. The issue with using tokens in this ecosystem is the volatility. There's two issues, actually. One's the volatility of the token, right? Like, how do you, a healthcare service, if I'm going to go for a consultation, I need to know it costs X amount of, tokens. It cannot cost X today and, 20X tomorrow. So that's one problem. The second problem is most people in this ecosystem don't want to deal with tokens. So the people we're talking to, they want the decentralized governance, the trustless transaction layer, the unlocking of data. But when it comes to people claiming their value, so when they give the data and then they get paid for it, they want them to get fiat out of it. So what we are actually looking at right now is on-ramps and off-ramps that are seamless, right? So we're talking to a few partners who literally, people just deal with fiat in wherever they are, and the swap happens behind the scenes at some market rate against some pool that's been created in a DEX or something, right? So I think that's the other part. But I think the other, on that note, we spoke to one partner, and they said that they'd like their trial participants to have an option of taking crypto or fiat, because they also wanted to kind of get them excited and engaged, right? So maybe there is some really unhealthy person who's into crypto, and maybe now this is a way for them to plug into this ecosystem because they want to speculate on crypto, or they want to get some tokens, and hopefully the tokens So maybe indirectly, we are bringing people who are generally not interested in participating in proactive healthcare. We are bringing them into this. So they want to give them the option. Either you get your payment in crypto or you get it in fiat.
I can certainly see that the first 2 points you outlined being solved fairly straightforwardly in my mind. One is you can just have the token be a transactional token. So instead of people holding the token, they would hold like a TrueFi stable token for Australia. Actually, I interviewed the founder, and he has a stable token pegged to the Australian dollar. Is it Australian dollar?
Yeah, dollar. Australian dollar.
So effectively, that would be the reserve currency in the DAO, and then the token would effectively just be like a transactional token to move. And you could also, I mean, the second there definitely are providers out there now that will they'll receive any token you have or stable currency, and then they'll just send a wire transfer, bank check. They'll act as that middleman.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some really cool, like we spoke to one that it's a browser plugin. You can send a token into it and you get fiat through. It's really cool. They don't just give you fiat; they immediately give you a disposable, one of those Visa cards that you can kind of, like if you're shopping online, you can just put in some fiat, and within a few seconds you get like a Visa card number that you can use to buy anything you want. And behind the scenes, it's really cool. What they're actually doing is they're talking to a DEX pool, and they're doing the swap behind the scenes to stablecoins. So they basically take your token, swap it to stablecoin USDC, and then they have an on-ramp to fiat, and then through Visa, they show you a card. So it all happens within a few seconds. It's really incredible technology.
That's super cool. So what's top of mind for you nowadays? You have obviously Ethereum. I saw the raise. I was looking at the tokenomics. Is Itheum just dead set on the next milestone? Do you feel like the project is in kind of exploratory phase? What's next? I guess I'm asking.
Yeah, so we've completed raise. We launched our token in March, taking a hit now like everybody else because of the market, but I mean that's fine. So we are firstly we are multi-chain protocol, so we are not explicitly on one chain. So our implementation of the data cat and the data dex is the data cat's actually already live in production. The data dex is about 80% complete. You can use it in multiple EVM testnets, Ethereum, Binance Smart Chain. But what we're working on right now is a mirror implementation in Elrond, because Elrond's a non-EVM chain. So we are rewriting our smart contracts. And the reason we're doing this is we believe that for a data platform, like specifically we are giving people ownership of the data and control of it. It cannot be tied to a chain. We can't be biased to a chain. We have to support all chains. People are going to have different preferences. We like Elrond because Elrond's super fast, super cheap. Like it's very negligible. You won't even know you're using blockchain, and the user experience is great. So we're sticking to Elrond there. So our goals are very, very, so we are very clear about our roadmap. So we can go and have a look at our public roadmap at itheum.io/roadmap. Next, we're working on those two streams, gaming and health. Health from a big problem perspective, because we really want to go after the big problems. Gaming to get our tech to mainnet. So next month, we're launching our Gamer Passport with a collaboration with a really hot game called Wonder Hero and a really hot guild called the Polkastarter Gaming Guild. And this demonstrates how a gamer in Web3 could move between games and move between guilds, and their data footprint is tracked into that Gamer Passport. And they made this really cool identity product called the NFMe ID Avatar, and it's all linked. It's really cool. And this same model is what we want to now then explore in traditional health as well, because it's the same thing. The gamer is now the patient. The patient's moving between clinics. Their data is being linked to them, and then they are able to go into the data dex, mint it as tokens, or get an NFMe ID avatar, prove the provenance of the data, and then trade it. So what we discovered is we have effectively created a paradigm for unlocking data. And I think this is a very strong paradigm. And the other thing we discovered was, as we're talking about it, is it brings equal value for all participants. You as a patient or a gamer, and the provider and the payer and everyone in this ecosystem. So I think we really want to focus on getting this out. We're very close to it. Like literally next month, we're going to demonstrate the game of passport. But yeah, I'm really excited about health, though. Just like we had this discussion, I think that's where the real sort of the real value is going to be seen.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think you have the right approach. If coming from my perspective, that gaming is lightweight in the sense that these aren't massively consequential decisions that people are going to be making. Like it's games, but they're also fast adopting. And then healthcare, huge implications, slow moving industry, but you have to prove out the model, have some examples to show people to get people excited and on board. So I hope to have you back on someday. This is awesome. Are you writing publicly or tweeting personally? I see you have.
Yeah, so I've got to. I do tweet. I've got to improve my. I've been a bit preoccupied in the last few months, but I want to get back into the writing. Like I've got a bunch of stuff that I'm writing. I had a really. So this is going to come out next month. I had a really interesting interview yesterday where they wanted me to envision what digital health and government would look like in 2030 if Itheum became mainstream, and I really came up with this real like a timeline of events that's going to lead to decentralization of data and stuff. So I'll share this. I'll share this with you once it's published in July. But I think that made me also kind of realize that wow, this is heading in a good direction. So
did you outline this verbally on the podcast, or was it in some written article you made?
Yeah, it was actually by KPMG. So KPMG does this annual event called Voices of 30, where they get people in different industries to imagine themselves in 2030, speaking to somebody in 2022, telling them to avoid certain things. So I spoke on what would government look like in 2030. So it's going to be a global publication that comes out next month. But yeah, I thought it was really fascinating. And this is kind of like an area now I'm kind of interested in, is envisioning what it could be, like even just the discussion we had right now. What could it be? What could it look like in 8 years from now? And then how do we reach that stage, right? Like what are the series of events that needs to happen, good and bad, to reach that stage? That kind of thought exercise is quite interesting.
Yeah, specifically the intersection of government, healthcare, and blockchain.
Yeah.
That's
and I think one thing I did mention in that is that the big paradigm shift might come when there's going to be such a big data breach that you can't ignore this anymore. And if you look at all government data, it's literally stored in the cloud. They're not stored on premise anymore in most instances. They're stored in the cloud with the same weak security that a lot of other enterprises have got. So I think the real eye-opener would be if one of these clouds is breached at a level that exposes the identity of 80% of a country's citizens. You can't ignore blockchain and Web3 anymore after that point.
Yeah, that'll be a good place to be. I mean, right, there's always a silver lining, but I feel part of the massive leak of the credit unions, like Experian was hacked, and they came out with like there's major motivation to make a better system. Like humans, like us humans, we don't know what the future is, and we can only react to what happens. And so when shit happens, that's motivation.
Well, COVID, man.
Yeah.
If you look at what happened to telehealth during COVID, like 10 years worth of growth in a few months, right?
Totally.
So we definitely can adapt and adopt. It's just that we need to be pushed to that extreme to do it. So
yeah, man. Well, keep me in the loop. I love what you're working on, and hope you keep crushing it.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
All right, Mark. Take it easy.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.